A newlywed couple vanished without a trace during their tropical honeymoon in 1984, leaving their families devastated and authorities baffled. 21 years later, a shocking discovery in the jungle would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what really happened to them. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. We'd be happy to have you here with us. In the quiet morning air of Denver, Colorado, Sarah Mitchell clutched the phone with trembling hands as Detective Santos delivered the words that would shatter 21 years of agonizing uncertainty. The call had awakened her from restless sleep, where she had been marking another painful anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. Detective Santos spoke carefully from Key Largo, Florida, explaining that evidence potentially connected to Jessica and Michael's case had been discovered in the jungle near their last known location. 3 days earlier, Jake Morrison had been hiking off the beaten trail near the old Playa Escondida resort area in the Florida Keys when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Deep in the dense tropical forest, a hollow tree trunk caught his attention, and inside he found wet clothing that appeared to have been recently disturbed by heavy rains. The bright blue shirt and vibrant red dress were crumpled together, their colors still vivid despite years of exposure to the elements. Jake immediately contacted local authorities, recognizing the potential significance of his discovery in an area known for its tragic history. The seasoned tourist had heard stories about couples who had vanished in the region during the 80s, and something about the pristine condition of the clothing suggested they had been protected from complete decomposition by the tree's natural shelter. His hands shook as he photographed the scene before carefully marking the location for police investigators. Within hours, Detective Maria Santos and her team had secured the area and begun preliminary examination of the evidence. The clothing matched descriptions from missing person reports filed decades earlier, and the location corresponded with search areas that had been combed repeatedly during the original investigation. "This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," Santos told her partner as they carefully documented every detail of the scene. When Detective Santos placed the call to Sarah Mitchell, she could barely comprehend the words being spoken to her across the phone line. "Mrs. Mitchell, we may have found evidence related to your daughter Jessica's disappearance," Santos said gently, knowing the devastating impact these words would have. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she gripped the phone tighter. "Clothing that matches the description from your original missing person report," Santos replied carefully. Sarah's immediate reaction was a mixture of hope and terror that sent her to her knees in her Denver kitchen. 21 years of wondering, praying, and clinging to the possibility that Jessica might still be alive somewhere crashed down around her in that moment. "Are you certain it's them?" she managed to ask through her tears. "We're running tests now, but the preliminary indicators are very strong," Santos responded with professional compassion. Through tears and shaking hands, Sarah called her sister Margaret, trying to explain what Detective Santos had told her about the discovery. "They found clothes, Maggie," she whispered into the phone, her voice breaking with each word. "Jessica's red dress and Michael's blue shirt." Margaret's sharp intake of breath was audible across the line. "Oh, honey, are you sure you're ready for this?" Margaret asked gently. "I have to know," Sarah replied firmly despite her trembling voice. Despite Margaret's protests about traveling alone in her emotional state, Sarah's determination crystallized into immediate action. "I'm booking a flight to Florida right now," she declared, already moving toward her computer. "Sarah, please think about this," Margaret pleaded. "What if it's not them? What if it is?" Sarah's response was unwavering. "Either way, I need to be there. I've waited 21 years for answers, and I won't wait another day." Sarah spent a sleepless night making flight arrangements and preparing for a journey she had both dreaded and longed for since 1984. She called Detective Santos back twice, asking more questions. "Can I see the evidence when I arrive? What condition is everything in?" Santos patiently answered what she could, while explaining that some information would need to wait until Sarah arrived, and proper procedures were followed. The next morning, Sarah's flight landed at Miami International Airport, where Detective Santos waited with a calm professionalism that barely masked her own concern about the case. "Mrs. Mitchell," Santos approached with a gentle smile. "Thank you for coming all this way to meet me," Sarah said, her voice still shaky from the emotional journey. "This is important enough to handle in person," Santos replied as they walked toward the exit. During the drive to the Key Largo area, Sarah stared out at the tropical paradise that had become the setting for her family's worst nightmare. "Jessica described this place as heaven on earth during our last phone call," she told Detective Santos quietly. She was so excited about exploring the nature trails with Michael. Santos nodded sympathetically. "We're going to find out what happened to them," she promised, though her tone carried the weight of 21 years of unanswered questions. Detective Santos turned to Sarah as they neared their destination, her expression grave with the weight of information she had not yet shared. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else about the discovery that you need to know," she said quietly, her voice heavy with professional duty and personal sympathy. "What is it?" Sarah asked, bracing herself for more devastating news. "The clothing wasn't found alone. We discovered human remains in the immediate vicinity. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to hear more stories like this one." At the discovery site deep in the Florida Keys jungle, Sarah stood frozen as Detective Santos led her to the exact spot where Jessica's clothing had been found. The hollow tree trunk seemed impossibly small to contain such devastating evidence, and Sarah found herself asking questions that had haunted her for decades. "How long do you think they were here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the tropical forest around them. Within the immediate area, police technicians continued their methodical examination of the scene, uncovering additional pieces of evidence that had been scattered by years of weather and wildlife activity. Small personal items emerged from the undergrowth, a tarnished bracelet, fragments of what appeared to be a camera, and other belongings that painted a picture of an interrupted honeymoon. Detective Santos carefully documented each discovery while explaining the painstaking process to Sarah. Back at the renovated Playa Escondida resort, Sarah began her own investigation by approaching longtime staff members who might remember the events of 1984. The current manager, Roberto Martinez, introduced her to Elena Vasquez, a housekeeper who had worked there for over 30 years. "I need to ask you about a couple who stayed here in 1984, Sarah said carefully. "Jessica Mitchell and Michael Torres. They disappeared during their honeymoon." Elena's expression immediately grew somber as she nodded in recognition. Through Elena's recollections, Sarah learned disturbing details about Jessica's relationship with her ex-boyfriend David Chen, who had made threatening phone calls to the resort during the honeymoon week. "The young woman was very upset about calls from someone back home," Elena explained in heavily accented English. "She told me a man named David had threatened to stop her wedding. Said she was making a terrible mistake." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized David's obsession had followed Jessica even to this remote paradise. That evening, at her hotel room in Key Largo, Sarah received her first anonymous phone call that would mark the beginning of a campaign of intimidation. The phone rang at exactly midnight, and when she answered, she heard only heavy breathing on the other end of the line. "Hello? Who is this?" she asked repeatedly, but the caller remained silent until the line went dead. The call left her feeling unsettled and strangely vulnerable in the unfamiliar surroundings. The following morning, Detective Santos conducted interviews with current resort management about employee records from the 1980s, hoping to identify staff members who might have had contact with the missing couple. The process proved challenging, as many records from that era had been lost during Hurricane Andrew in 1992. However, they managed to locate some personnel files that provided a starting point for their investigation into who had access to guest information during that fateful week. During their review of the surviving employment records, one name emerged as particularly relevant to their investigation: Carlos Mendez, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the resort during 1984. He was responsible for room maintenance and had master keys to all guest areas, the current maintenance chief explained to Detective Santos. Carlos was a good worker, kept to himself mostly. Left suddenly after that summer, never gave proper notice. The information seemed routine, with nothing to suggest anything suspicious about his departure. Throughout her second day in the Keys, Sarah began experiencing strange coincidences that made her increasingly uncomfortable about her surroundings. The same dark sedan appeared to follow her rental car from the hotel to the resort and back, always maintaining a careful distance. At restaurants and shops, she noticed a man in a baseball cap who seemed to be watching her, though he always looked away when she tried to make eye contact. Determined to pursue every possible lead, Sarah contacted Jessica's college friends in Denver to gather more information about David Chen's behavior before the wedding. Her friend Monica revealed disturbing details about David's obsession with Jessica during their relationship and his inability to accept their breakup. He used to show up at her apartment unannounced, Monica explained over the phone. Jessica was actually afraid of him toward the end. He kept saying she belonged with him and that he would never let another man have her. Late that night, Sarah received a second anonymous phone call that escalated the intimidation campaign to a new level of directness. This time, instead of silence, a whispered voice spoke clearly through the receiver. "Stop looking for what you will not want to find." The caller hung up immediately, leaving Sarah shaking as she realized someone was actively monitoring her investigation and wanted her to abandon her search for answers about Jessica's disappearance. Despite her growing unease about the anonymous calls, Sarah tried to dismiss them as cruel pranks from someone who had heard about her presence in the area. However, she could not shake the feeling that she was being constantly observed, and every interaction with strangers began to feel potentially threatening. The coincidences were becoming too frequent to ignore, and her instincts told her that someone definitely did not want her to continue digging into the events of 1984. When Sarah returned to her hotel room that evening, she discovered a handwritten note that had been slipped under her door while she was having dinner. The message was brief but chilling in its directness. Some secrets should stay buried. The paper was common notebook stock that could have come from anywhere, and the writing was carefully printed to avoid identification. Sarah stared at the note with trembling hands, realizing that her investigation had clearly struck a nerve with someone who preferred the truth to remain hidden. The threatening note prompted Sarah to contact Detective Santos immediately the next morning, spreading the paper carefully on the detective's desk while explaining how she had found it. Santos examined the message with professional concern, recognizing that the investigation had clearly provoked someone into direct action. "This changes everything about your safety here," Santos told Sarah firmly. "We need to take protective steps right away. Someone obviously doesn't want you asking questions about what happened to Jessica and Michael." During their extended conversation at the police station, Sarah shared intimate details about Jessica and Michael's relationship that painted a picture of a deeply happy young couple. "They had been planning this honeymoon for 8 months, Sarah explained to Detective Santos, her voice filled with remembered joy and current pain. "Jessica called me every few days leading up to the trip, so excited about exploring the nature trails and swimming in the clear water. Michael was just as thrilled. He had never been to a tropical location before." Sarah's pursuit of David Chen took a disturbing turn when employment records from his law firm showed an unexpected gap in his usual routine. David had taken a sudden week of vacation time during the exact period when Jessica and Michael disappeared. His colleagues remember it being unusual because he never took time off and gave very short notice, Detective Santos explained to Sarah after speaking with David's former supervisor in Denver. While pursuing the David Chen lead, Sarah also began looking into Dr. Raymond Foster, who had served as the resort's on-call physician during the 1980s. Elena Vasquez, the longtime housekeeper, provided disturbing information about the doctor's behavior around young couples during that era. Dr. Foster always made excuses to check on honeymooners, Elena told Sarah privately. He would ask too many personal questions, want to know their room numbers and daily schedules. The other staff thought his interest was strange, but he was a doctor, so nobody questioned him directly. Through additional interviews with former resort employees, Sarah learned that Dr. Foster had maintained detailed unofficial records about guest couples that went far beyond normal medical documentation. A retired security guard named Miguel remembered seeing Foster taking photographs of couples without their knowledge during romantic dinners and beach walks. He said it was for medical research about stress and relationships, Miguel explained, but it made everyone uncomfortable. Young wives would complain that he stared at them too much during routine health consultations. That evening, the anonymous harassment became much more serious when Sarah received a phone call that left no doubt about the caller's intentions. The voice was clear and threatening. "Stop now, or join them in the jungle." The caller hung up immediately, but the message was unmistakably direct and personal. Sarah sat on her hotel bed, shaking as she realized that someone was watching her investigation closely enough to know exactly what she was doing and where she was staying. When Sarah returned to her hotel room after dinner, she discovered that someone had broken her window and searched through her belongings while she was out. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but her clothes had been scattered across the floor, and her personal items had been deliberately moved and rearranged. The message was clear. Someone had complete access to her private space and wanted her to know that nowhere was safe from their reach. Determined to confront David Chen directly, Sarah obtained his current phone number and called him at his Denver law office the next morning. His reaction to her call was immediately suspicious and evasive. "I don't know why you're calling me about Jessica," David said nervously. "That was over 20 years ago. I was traveling during that time anyway. I had nothing to do with what happened to them." His defensive tone and quick denials only strengthened Sarah's suspicions about his potential involvement. During another conversation with resort staff, an elderly maintenance worker named Roberto mentioned Carlos Mendez in passing while discussing the employee turnover from the 1980s. "Carlos was a good worker, very quiet, kept to himself mostly," Roberto explained, without any hint of suspicion in his voice. "He knew all the jungle trails better than anyone because he grew up in the area. After that couple disappeared, he just stopped showing up for work one day, never said goodbye or collected his final paycheck." Attempts to locate Dr. Foster for direct questioning proved frustratingly difficult, as the retired physician had apparently moved away from Florida years earlier without leaving clear forwarding information. The medical board had no current address for him, and his former colleagues at the resort had lost touch with him completely. "It's like he deliberately made himself hard to find," Detective Santos told Sarah, after spending hours making unsuccessful phone calls to various medical associations and retirement communities. The threats against Sarah became physical when she discovered that all 4 tires on her rental car had been slashed during the night. The cuts were clean and deliberate, clearly the work of someone with a knife who wanted to send a message about the consequences of continuing her investigation. Hotel security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact time period when the vandalism occurred, leaving no footage of the perpetrator's identity. Just as Sarah was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the multiple directions of her investigation, Detective Santos received an anonymous phone tip that could change everything about their focus on David Chen. The caller claimed to have seen a man matching David's description in the Key Largo area during the summer of 1984, specifically around the time of Jessica and Michael's disappearance. The tipster said he remembered because the man seemed out of place, wearing a business suit in tropical weather and asking too many questions about young couples at the resort. Santos explained to Sarah with renewed interest in pursuing the Denver lawyer as their primary suspect. With the anonymous tip about David Chen's possible presence in the Keys during 1984, Detective Santos immediately contacted the Denver Police Department to request assistance with verifying the lawyer's whereabouts during that crucial time period. The Denver detectives agreed to examine David's travel records, credit card statements, and any other documentation that might confirm or deny his presence in Florida during Jessica and Michael's honeymoon week. "We need concrete proof, not just witness memories from 20 years ago," Santos explained to Sarah as they waited for the official response. During her continued interviews with longtime Key Largo residents, Sarah learned about Tommy "Snake" Rodriguez, a local boat captain who had operated unauthorized tourist excursions during the 1980s. Carmen Silva, who had worked at the marina for 30 years, remembered Tommy's reputation for taking couples to isolated areas that were considered dangerous by other boat operators. "Tommy always promised tourists the most beautiful, secret spots," Carmen told Sarah with obvious concern. "But he took them places where nobody else would go, places where you could disappear and never be found." Local residents painted a disturbing picture of Tommy Rodriguez as someone who deliberately sought out young couples for his illegal boat tours. Miguel Santos, a longtime fisherman, recalled Tommy's aggressive marketing tactics around the resort areas during the summer of 1984. He would approach honeymooners directly, promise them private beaches and hidden waterfalls, Miguel explained. Tommy charged double what the legal tour operators charged, but he guaranteed complete privacy. That should have been a warning sign for anyone with common sense. Police records revealed that Tommy Rodriguez had an extensive criminal history that included multiple arrests for assault, robbery, and operating vessels without proper licensing during the 1980s. Detective Santos shared the background information with Sarah, explaining that Tommy's pattern of criminal behavior made him a credible suspect in the disappearance. He specialized in targeting tourists who had money and were unfamiliar with the area, Santos said. Young couples on honeymoon would have been perfect victims for someone like Tommy Rodriguez. The anonymous phone calls targeting Sarah became more frequent and specific, with the caller now making references that proved intimate knowledge of her daily activities. "You're getting too close to something you shouldn't know," the voice warned during one late-night call, with distinctive jungle sounds audible in the background. The caller seemed to be phoning from an outdoor location, possibly the same forest area where Jessica and Michael had disappeared. Sarah felt increasingly unsafe as the harassment intensified with each passing day. When Sarah returned to her hotel room after interviewing marina workers, she found that someone had again broken into her space and left a much more direct threat than before. Her clothes were scattered across the floor, and a message had been written on the bathroom mirror in what appeared to be red lipstick: "Stop digging or die." The intrusion felt more personal and violent than the previous incidents, suggesting that her investigation was making someone increasingly desperate to silence her permanently. After days of searching, Detective Santos finally located Dr. Raymond Foster, living in a retirement community near Tampa, Florida, and arranged for an interview the following week. Dr. Foster initially claimed he couldn't remember details from the 1980s, Santos explained to Sarah after their phone conversation. "But when I mentioned the specific dates and the missing couple, he became very cooperative and agreed to meet with us. He said he's been expecting someone to contact him about that time period for years." Another former resort employee provided additional information about Carlos Mendez that began to paint a more concerning picture of his sudden departure in 1984. Rosa Martinez, who had worked in housekeeping with Elena, remembered that Carlos had seemed increasingly agitated during the weeks following the couple's disappearance. "Carlos started acting very strange after those tourists went missing," Rosa told Sarah privately. "He would ask too many questions about what the police were doing, what guests were saying. Then one day he just vanished, left all his belongings in his room and never came back." Harbor records from 1984 confirmed that Tommy Rodriguez had indeed operated his boat tour business during the exact week when Jessica and Michael disappeared from the resort. The documentation showed that Tommy had taken several couples out on private excursions during that time period, though his record-keeping was deliberately vague about specific destinations and passenger names. "Tommy never wanted official records of where he took people," explained the current harbor master. "That way he couldn't be held responsible if something went wrong." The harassment campaign against Sarah took an even more threatening turn when an anonymous caller demonstrated detailed knowledge of her daily schedule and personal habits. "I know you had lunch at the Marina restaurant today," the voice said during a call to her hotel room. "I know you spoke with Carmen Silva and Miguel Santos. I know you're planning to interview Dr. Foster next week." The caller's intimate knowledge of her activities proved that someone was conducting constant surveillance of her movements throughout the Keys area. Technical problems began plaguing Sarah's stay at the hotel, with her room key card mysteriously failing multiple times each day and her phone service being intermittently disrupted during important calls. The hotel staff claimed these were random technical difficulties, but the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "Every time I try to make progress on the investigation, something goes wrong with my basic necessities," Sarah complained to Detective Santos, who began to suspect that someone with technical skills was deliberately sabotaging her communications and access. Just as Sarah was preparing to focus more intensively on Tommy Rodriguez as a primary suspect, David Chen's sister Linda called Detective Santos with information that completely changed their perspective on the Denver lawyer's potential involvement. "I need to tell you something important about my brother's whereabouts in 1984, Linda said during the emotional phone call. David wasn't traveling for pleasure during Jessica's honeymoon week. He was in a private rehabilitation facility in Colorado, receiving treatment for alcohol addiction. I have all the medical records and admission documents to prove it." Linda Chen's phone call to Detective Santos completely cleared her brother David of any involvement in Jessica and Michael's disappearance, providing medical documentation that proved his whereabouts during the crucial time period. The rehabilitation facility records showed that David had been admitted for alcohol treatment 3 days before Jessica's honeymoon began and remained there for 30 days under supervised care. David was ashamed of his addiction problems, Linda explained to Santos and Sarah during a conference call. "That's why he was so evasive when you contacted him. He didn't want anyone to know about his treatment. With David Chen's suspicious behavior now explained by his personal struggles with alcoholism, rather than any criminal intent, Sarah felt both relief and frustration about losing a major suspect. "I understand why he seemed guilty when I called him," Sarah told Detective Santos as they reviewed the medical documentation Linda had provided. "But this means we're back to square one with the investigation. David's evasiveness was about protecting his reputation, not covering up a crime." The revelation forced them to redirect their focus toward the remaining suspects and evidence. While reviewing evidence stored at the police station, Sarah made a personal discovery that sent chills through her entire body. Among Jessica's personal effects was a postcard she had written but never sent, found in her purse after the disappearance. The message read, "Mom, this place is paradise. The friendly maintenance man Carlos helped fix our air conditioning and gave us tips about the best trails to explore. Love you." Sarah stared at the postcard with trembling hands, realizing that Jessica had specifically mentioned Carlos Mendez by name just before she vanished. Armed with this new information about Dr. Foster's location, Sarah and Detective Santos drove to the retirement community near Tampa to conduct their long-awaited interview with the former resort physician. The facility was a pleasant, well-maintained complex where Dr. Foster lived quietly among other retirees who had relocated to Florida for their golden years. "Dr. Foster has been expecting you," the facility director told them as she led them to a comfortable visiting room where the elderly doctor waited nervously for their arrival. The anonymous phone calls targeting Sarah became disturbingly specific, with the caller demonstrating intimate knowledge of her personal information and daily routines. "I know you're staying in room 237, the voice said during one particularly unsettling call. "I know you eat breakfast at 8:30 every morning and drive the blue rental car with license plate number HJR 4829. You should be very careful about accidents that happen to people who ask too many questions." The detailed surveillance information left Sarah feeling completely exposed and vulnerable. Technical sabotage against Sarah intensified when her rental car mysteriously broke down on the highway between Key Largo and Tampa, forcing her to call for emergency roadside assistance. The tow truck driver who responded to her call mentioned something that made her blood run cold. "Funny thing," he said while loading her car. "Yesterday someone called asking about a blue rental car with your exact license plate number. Wanted to know what kind of car it was and where it might be serviced. I thought that was pretty strange." Dr. Raymond Foster proved to be a cooperative but disturbing interview subject who revealed his obsessive documentation habits regarding resort guests during his tenure in the 1980s. "I kept detailed notes about every couple I treated," Foster explained to Sarah and Detective Santos, showing them boxes of meticulously organized files. "I was conducting unofficial research about stress patterns in honeymooning couples for a book I planned to write." However, Foster's medical conference attendance records provided him with a solid alibi, proving he was in Miami during the exact dates of Jessica and Michael's disappearance. Maintenance records from the resort revealed that Carlos Mendez had possessed master keys to all guest rooms and common areas during his employment in 1984. More significantly, the records showed that Carlos had specifically requested a schedule change to work the third floor of the resort during the week when Jessica and Michael were staying there. "Carlos normally worked the first and second floors," explained the current maintenance supervisor. "But that week he asked to switch assignments with another worker. He said he wanted to learn the third floor systems better." Meanwhile, the investigation into Tommy Rodriguez continued to yield concerning information about his illegal boat tour operations during the summer of 1984. Harbor workers confirmed that Tommy had been operating almost daily during Jessica and Michael's honeymoon week, taking couples to remote locations that were considered dangerous by legitimate tour operators. "Tommy specialized in promising couples complete privacy," explained an old-timer at the marina. "He knew hiding spots where nobody would ever think to look for missing people." Physical intimidation against Sarah reached a new level when an unknown man confronted her directly in the hotel elevator, abandoning any pretense of anonymous harassment. "You need to go home now," the man said quietly as the elevator doors closed, trapping Sarah alone with him between floors. "Stop asking questions about things that happened a long time ago. Some people don't like being bothered about old business." The man exited on the next floor, leaving Sarah shaken and frightened about her personal safety. Detective Santos responded to the direct threat against Sarah by arranging for increased police protection and urging her to consider returning to Denver for her own safety. "This has gone beyond harassment," Santos told Sarah firmly during an emergency meeting at the police station. "Someone is clearly desperate to stop your investigation, and they're willing to use physical intimidation to achieve that goal. We need to take serious precautions about your movements and activities while you're in the Keys area." The most significant breakthrough in the case came when Detective Santos discovered that Carlos Mendez had specifically requested to work on the 3rd floor during the exact week of Jessica and Michael's stay. Personnel records showed that Carlos had never before asked for schedule changes during his 2 years of employment at the resort. "This wasn't a coincidence," Santos explained to Sarah as they reviewed the employment documents. "Carlos deliberately positioned himself to have access to Jessica and Michael's room during their honeymoon. He planned whatever happened to them in advance. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to hear more stories like this one." With Tommy Rodriguez emerging as a primary suspect, Detective Santos intensified her efforts to locate the boat he had operated during the summer of 1984. Harbor records led them to a marina in Isla Mirada, where Tommy's vessel had been docked during the crucial time period. The boat had been sold multiple times since then, but Santos managed to track down the current owner, who still had some of the original registration documents. "This boat has quite a history," the owner told Santos when she explained her investigation. Previous owners mentioned it was involved in some kind of legal trouble back in the 80s. Coast Guard records provided an unexpected revelation that completely eliminated Tommy Rodriguez as a suspect in Jessica and Michael's disappearance. Official documentation showed that Tommy's boat had been impounded by federal agents for drug smuggling activities during the exact week when the couple vanished from the resort. Tommy was arrested on Monday of that week, and his boat was seized, the Coast Guard official explained to Detective Santos. He was in federal custody through the following Sunday, which covers the entire period when your missing couple was last seen alive. The timing of Tommy's arrest provided him with an ironclad alibi that removed any possibility of his involvement in the disappearance. "Tommy may have been a criminal, but he wasn't our criminal," Detective Santos explained to Sarah as they reviewed the federal arrest records. While Jessica and Michael were enjoying their honeymoon, Tommy was sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting arraignment on drug charges. His illegal activities actually saved him from becoming a murder suspect 20 years later. While reviewing evidence boxes at the police station, Sarah made another devastating personal discovery that strengthened the case against Carlos Mendez. Hidden among Jessica's personal effects was a page from her vacation diary that contained a chilling entry about the resort's maintenance staff. "The maintenance man Carlos gives me the creeps," Jessica had written in her neat handwriting. "He keeps finding excuses to come to our room and stares at me in a way that makes me uncomfortable. Michael thinks I'm being paranoid, but something about Carlos feels wrong." With Dr. Foster's medical conference attendance records confirming his presence in Miami during the disappearance dates, Detective Santos officially removed him from their list of active suspects. Dr. Foster was definitely obsessive and inappropriate in his behavior toward couples, Santos told Sarah as they closed that particular line of investigation. "But he has rock-solid documentation proving he was attending medical seminars in Miami when Jessica and Michael vanished. His weird behavior was creepy but not criminal in this case." All investigative paths now pointed toward Carlos Mendez as the most likely perpetrator, prompting Sarah and Detective Santos to begin an intensive background check into his personal history and employment patterns. Carlos is the only suspect who had direct access to Jessica and Michael, specifically requested to work their floor, and disappeared immediately after they went missing, Santos explained, as they prepared to dig deeper into his past. Everything about his behavior suggests he was planning something involving that couple. Physical intimidation against Sarah became more brazen when a man approached her directly in the hotel lobby, claiming to be a concerned local resident. "I heard you've been asking a lot of dangerous questions around town," the man said with a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Some folks don't appreciate outsiders stirring up old troubles. You might want to consider that continuing your investigation could be hazardous to your health." The man walked away before Sarah could respond, leaving her shaken by the direct nature of the threat. Hotel management claimed that changing the locks on Sarah's room door was a routine maintenance procedure, but the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "We received a work order requesting new locks for your room," the desk clerk explained when Sarah complained about her key card no longer working. Our maintenance department said there was a security concern that required immediate attention. Sarah found it suspicious that the supposed security concern had never been explained to her directly. Further investigation into Carlos Mendez's employment at the resort revealed that he had unprecedented access to guest information and scheduling details. Resort records showed that Carlos regularly reviewed guest checkout schedules to plan his maintenance work, giving him advance knowledge of when rooms would be empty and when couples planned to leave for excursions. Carlos knew everyone's daily routine, explained a former supervisor who had worked with him. He made it his business to know when guests would be in their rooms and when they would be away. When Sarah attempted to leave the hotel parking garage, she discovered that her rental car had been deliberately blocked by another vehicle, with no driver in sight. A threatening note had been placed under her windshield wipers with a message written in block letters, "Go home before it's too late." The note was accompanied by a photograph of Sarah eating breakfast that morning, proving that someone had been conducting constant surveillance of her daily activities and could get close enough to photograph her without detection. Background checks into Carlos Mendez's employment history revealed a disturbing pattern of unstable job performance and sudden departures from various positions throughout the Florida Keys. Carlos would work somewhere for 6 to 18 months, then disappear without notice, explained a former employer from a Key West marina. He was a good worker when he was there, but he had a habit of vanishing whenever there was any kind of trouble or investigation. He never seemed to stay anywhere long enough to form real relationships with co-workers. The most disturbing revelation about Carlos Mendez came from Maria Santos, a former housekeeper who had worked alongside him at the resort during the early 1980s. Carlos had a strange obsession with taking pictures of young couples without their knowledge, Maria revealed during a private conversation with Sarah and Detective Santos. He would hide cameras in maintenance areas and guest corridors to photograph honeymooners. Carlos used to say that perfect young couples made him angry because they had everything he could never have. He collected those photos like some kind of twisted hobby. Property records from the county courthouse led Detective Santos to a modest mobile home community 20 miles inland from the original resort, where a man named Miguel Torres had purchased property with cash in 1985. The timing immediately caught Santos's attention, as the purchase date fell exactly 1 year after Jessica and Michael's disappearance. Miguel Torres fits Carlos Mendez's physical description perfectly, Santos explained to Sarah as they drove toward the mobile home park. Same age, same height, same general appearance, this could be our breakthrough. Long-term neighbors provided detailed descriptions of Miguel Torres that matched everything they knew about Carlos Mendez, painting a picture of a solitary man who had lived quietly in the community for 20 years. Miguel keeps to himself mostly, explained Dorothy Martinez, who had lived next door since 1987. He's always been polite but distant, never talks about his past or family. Strange thing is, he seems to know these jungle areas better than anyone, like he grew up here. Miguel can disappear into those woods and come back hours later without getting lost. Ground-penetrating radar equipment revealed disturbing anomalies in the jungle area directly behind Miguel Torres's property, where soil disturbance patterns suggested the presence of shallow graves. The radar operator pointed to clear evidence of 2 burial sites that had been carefully concealed beneath 20 years of jungle growth. These signatures are consistent with human burials, the technician explained to Detective Santos. The soil was definitely disturbed sometime in the past, and the patterns suggest deliberate placement rather than natural causes. When excavation confirmed human remains consistent with Jessica and Michael's physical descriptions, Sarah experienced the devastating emotional impact of finally learning her daughter's fate after 21 years of uncertainty. "My Jessica," she whispered, as she knelt in the jungle clearing, tears streaming down her face, while forensic workers carefully uncovered evidence that had been hidden for decades. Detective Santos placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder as they both realized that the long search for answers was approaching its tragic conclusion. Miguel Torres appeared at the edge of the excavation site, claiming he had noticed unusual police activity and come to investigate as a concerned property owner. "I don't know why you're digging on land behind my home," Miguel told Detective Santos with apparent confusion. "I'm Miguel Torres. I've lived here peacefully for 20 years, and I don't know anything about old bones or missing people. This is very disturbing to find out such terrible things happened so close to my property. His manner seemed nervous despite his protestations of innocence. Forensic examination confirmed that both victims had died from blunt force trauma and been buried in carefully prepared graves within days of their 1984 disappearance. The burial method shows intimate knowledge of this terrain, the medical examiner explained to Sarah and Detective Santos. Whoever did this knew exactly where to hide bodies so they wouldn't be discovered accidentally. The location is perfect for concealment, far enough from the main trail but close enough for easy access by someone familiar with the area. During initial questioning, Miguel Torres became increasingly evasive when Detective Santos asked about his activities and residence during 1984. "I moved to Florida in 1985, Miguel insisted, avoiding direct eye contact with the officers. "I don't know anything about what happened before I arrived here. I came from another state looking for work and a quiet place to live. Whatever happened to those poor people occurred before my time in this area." His answers seemed rehearsed and carefully constructed to avoid specific details. Careful examination of Miguel's story revealed multiple inconsistencies with documented evidence, property records, and neighbor testimony that suggested his account was fabricated. Property documents showed the cash purchase had been made with bills that were sequentially numbered, suggesting a large withdrawal from a single source rather than accumulated savings. "The paper trail doesn't support Miguel's version of events," Detective Santos explained to Sarah. "Someone with Carlos Mendez's background would have had access to that kind of cash in 1984. Face-to-face confrontation occurred when Miguel directly approached Sarah near the excavation site, abandoning his previous claims of ignorance about the investigation. "You're stirring up dangerous trouble that should have been left alone," Miguel told Sarah with barely controlled anger. "Some things are better left buried, and some people should mind their own business instead of causing problems for innocent folks. You don't understand what you're getting involved in here." His threatening tone contradicted his earlier pose as a confused neighbor. Pressure from Detective Santos intensified when she presented Miguel with evidence that his identity documents were falsified and his story contained impossible timeline contradictions. "Miguel Torres was a child who died in 1960, Santos informed him during formal questioning. "Someone has been using his identity illegally for decades. We know you're not who you claim to be. So now is the time to tell us the truth about your real name and your connection to these murders." Miguel immediately demanded legal representation before answering further questions. Using his extensive knowledge of the jungle terrain surrounding his property, Miguel managed to slip away from police surveillance and disappear into the dense forest, where he held significant tactical advantages. "I knows every trail, cave, and hiding spot in this wilderness," Detective Santos explained to her backup officers as they organized search teams. "Miguel has been living on the edge of this jungle for 20 years, and he's probably prepared for exactly this kind of situation. We need to be very careful about how we approach capturing him." The definitive proof of Miguel's true identity came when police discovered a hidden compartment in his mobile home containing original identification documents belonging to Carlos Mendez, birth certificate, social security card, and old driver's license, confirmed that Miguel Torres was indeed Carlos Mendez, who had been living under a stolen identity since 1985. "Carlos has been hiding in plain sight for 20 years, Detective Santos told Sarah as they examined the evidence. "He killed Jessica and Michael, then created a new life using a dead child's identity, never leaving the area where he buried his victims. DNA evidence from the burial site provided definitive confirmation that Carlos Mendez was responsible for Jessica and Michael's murders, ending any remaining doubt about his guilt. Forensic analysis matched Carlos's genetic material to evidence found on the victims' clothing and personal belongings that had been preserved in the jungle environment. The DNA match is conclusive," the forensic specialist explained to Detective Santos and Sarah. "Carlos Mendez killed your daughter and son-in-law, then buried them behind the property where he's been living under a false identity for 20 years. Psychological evaluation of Carlos's background revealed the complete picture of his obsession with destroying happy couples, tracing the disturbing pattern back to severe childhood abandonment trauma. Carlos was rejected by multiple foster families who initially showed interest in adopting him," explained Dr. Patricia Wells, the consulting psychologist. "Each rejection involved couples who decided they wanted biological children instead of adopting Carlos. This created a deep-seated hatred of happy couples that manifested in his need to destroy what he could never have for himself. No longer bothering to hide his presence, Carlos began stalking Sarah openly around the Key Largo area, appearing at restaurants and shops where she was conducting business. Hotel staff reported seeing a man matching Carlos's description sitting in the lobby for hours, watching the elevators and noting when Sarah came and went. "He's not even trying to be subtle anymore," Detective Santos told Sarah during an emergency meeting. "Carlos knows we've identified him, so he's abandoned any pretense of being an innocent bystander." During the search of Carlos's mobile home, police discovered detailed surveillance notes that proved he had been monitoring Sarah's activities since the day she arrived in Florida. The handwritten logs included her daily schedule, the people she interviewed, the restaurants where she ate, and even her sleeping patterns observed from outside her hotel. "Carlos documented everything about your investigation," Detective Santos explained to Sarah as they reviewed the disturbing evidence. "He knew exactly what you were doing at every moment of every day." Carlos attempted to corner Sarah in the hotel parking garage late one evening as she returned from dinner. Sarah noticed him approaching her rental car and managed to get inside and lock the doors before he could reach her. "I know who you are now, Carlos," she shouted through the car window as he stood outside, staring at her with cold hatred. Carlos smiled and walked away without saying a word, but his message was clear. He could get to her whenever he wanted. Evidence recovered from Carlos's mobile home painted a horrifying picture of his criminal activities, including photographs of Jessica and Michael taken without their knowledge during their honeymoon week. Additional photos showed other young couples from various resorts throughout the Florida Keys, suggesting that Carlos had been stalking potential victims for years. "We found over 200 photographs of couples," Detective Santos told Sarah grimly. "Carlos was hunting for the perfect victims, and Jessica and Michael fit whatever sick criteria he was using to select his targets." Detailed examination of the evidence revealed Carlos's method for luring couples to remote locations where he could attack them without witnesses. Resort maintenance records showed that Carlos had used his position to gain access to guest information, learning their schedules and planned activities. Carlos would recommend specific trails or hidden beaches to couples, then follow them to isolated areas where he could attack without being discovered, Detective Santos explained. He used his local knowledge and maintenance position to create opportunities for murder. Police tracking efforts led them to an abandoned resort building deep in the jungle area where Carlos had apparently been hiding since escaping surveillance. The building had been closed for renovations since Hurricane Andrew and provided perfect cover for someone familiar with the local terrain. "Carlos knows this area better than our officers do," Detective Santos admitted to Sarah as they coordinated the search efforts. "He's been living in this jungle for 20 years, and he knows every hiding spot and escape route available to him." Phone calls from Carlos became increasingly threatening as he promised that Sarah would join Jessica in death if she didn't immediately leave Florida. "How you think you're so smart finding my home and digging up my backyard?" Carlos said during one particularly chilling call. "But you have no idea how this story ends. Jessica cried for her mother when I killed her, and you're going to cry for Jessica when I kill you. You should have minded your own business and stayed in Denver where you belonged." Despite intensive search efforts involving multiple law enforcement agencies, Carlos managed to evade capture by using his intimate knowledge of the jungle terrain to stay one step ahead of pursuing officers. "Carlos has been preparing for this situation for 20 years, Detective Santos explained to the assembled search teams. "He knows every cave, every trail, and every hiding spot in this wilderness. We're dealing with someone who has significant tactical advantages on his home territory, so we need to be extremely careful about how we approach this manhunt." Carlos began calling Sarah with graphic descriptions of Jessica and Michael's final moments, apparently hoping to break her spirit and force her to abandon the investigation. "Your precious Jessica begged for her life," Carlos told Sarah during one devastating phone call. "She promised me money, jewelry, anything I wanted, if I would just let her go home to her mother. But I explained to her that some people don't deserve to be happy, and some couples need to be punished for having what others can never have." The final ultimatum came when Carlos issued a direct challenge that would determine the outcome of their deadly game of cat and mouse. "If you want to see where your daughter spent her last moments alive, meet me at the original resort tomorrow night at midnight," Carlos said with chilling calmness. "Come alone, or I disappear forever, and you'll never know the complete truth about what I did to Jessica and Michael. This is your only chance to hear the whole story before I vanish into the jungle, where nobody will ever find me again." Against Detective Santos's strong recommendations about personal safety, Sarah made the dangerous decision to meet Carlos at the original resort location where Jessica and Michael had spent their final happy moments. "I need to hear what he has to say about Jessica's last moments," Sarah told Santos firmly, despite the obvious risks involved. "This monster has stolen 21 years of my life by keeping me in the dark about what happened to my daughter. I'm not going to let him disappear into the jungle without getting the complete truth about how she died." Careful planning allowed Detective Santos to position surveillance teams around the resort perimeter while maintaining the appearance that Sarah was meeting Carlos alone as he had demanded. "We'll be close enough to intervene if anything goes wrong," Santos assured Sarah as they reviewed the tactical arrangements. "But we need to let Carlos talk first, because this may be our only chance to get a full confession about what he did to Jessica and Michael. Once he realizes we're there, he might stop talking and demand a lawyer." At exactly midnight, Carlos emerged from the jungle darkness near the original resort building, carrying what appeared to be a knife and moving with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the surrounding terrain. "I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to come," Carlos told Sarah as he approached her position near the entrance to the abandoned resort. "Most people don't have the stomach to hear the truth about what happens to perfect little couples who think they're better than everyone else." With chilling calmness, Carlos began confessing to the murders of Jessica and Michael, explaining his twisted psychological motivations for targeting young couples who represented everything he could never achieve. "I killed them because they had what I was always denied," Carlos told Sarah with no trace of remorse in his voice. "Happy couples make me sick with their perfect lives and their certainty that they deserve love and happiness. Jessica and Michael were so smug about their perfect relationship that they needed to be taught a lesson about how fragile happiness really is." Carlos provided horrifying details about how he had gained access to Jessica and Michael's room using his maintenance position, then lured them to a remote jungle trail by claiming he knew a secret waterfall. "I told them I could show them the most beautiful spot in the Keys, a place where only locals knew to go," Carlos explained with disturbing pride. "They were so trusting, so eager to have their perfect romantic adventure. Jessica even thanked me for being so helpful and friendly. They had no idea they were walking to their deaths." When Sarah recoiled in horror at Carlos's graphic description of the murders, he suddenly lunged toward her with the knife, apparently deciding that she had heard enough to seal her own fate. "Now you know everything, which means you can't be allowed to leave here alive," Carlos snarled as he attempted to grab Sarah. She managed to dodge his initial attack and screamed for help, hoping that Detective Santos was close enough to hear her desperate cries for assistance. Within seconds of Sarah's scream, Detective Santos and her backup officers emerged from their concealed positions around the resort grounds, surrounding Carlos before he could escape back into the jungle. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground," Santos shouted, as multiple officers trained their firearms on Carlos. He looked around wildly, realizing that he had been trapped by the police surveillance operation and that his 20-year run from justice was finally ending. After a brief attempt to flee through the resort grounds, Carlos was tackled and subdued by pursuing officers who had been prepared for his escape attempt. "It's over, Carlos," Detective Santos told him as they placed him in handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the murders of Jessica Mitchell and Michael Torres. You have the right to remain silent, but I suspect you're going to want to tell us everything about what you've been doing for the past 20 years. Carlos struggled against the restraints, but could not break free from police custody. Once in custody, Carlos seemed almost relieved to finally talk about his crimes, providing complete details about the murders and revealing the locations of additional evidence he had hidden throughout the jungle. "I've been carrying these secrets for 20 years, Carlos told Detective Santos during his formal confession. "Jessica fought harder than Michael did. She kept saying she wanted to go home to her mother, kept begging me to let them go. But I explained that some people don't deserve to be happy, and perfect couples need to be punished for their arrogance." Formal charges of double murder were filed against Carlos Mendez, finally giving Sarah the legal justice she had sought for over 2 decades of uncertainty and grief. "Carlos Mendez, you are charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jessica Mitchell and Michael Torres, the prosecutor announced during the arraignment hearing. Sarah sat in the courtroom gallery, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her daughter's killer would finally face consequences for his horrific crimes. During a supervised meeting at the county jail, Sarah confronted Carlos directly about the 21 years of anguish he had caused by keeping her in the dark about Jessica's fate. "You stole more than my daughter's life," Sarah told Carlos through the protective glass. "You stole 21 years of my life by making me wonder and hope and pray that she might still be alive somewhere. You could have ended my suffering at any time by telling the truth, but you chose to let me live in agony because you're a selfish, evil man." During transport from the courthouse back to the county jail, Carlos managed to escape from police custody when the transport van was involved in what appeared to be a carefully staged traffic accident. The collision was no accident, Detective Santos explained to Sarah over the phone. Carlos had help from someone on the outside who rammed the transport vehicle and created enough chaos for him to slip away during the confusion. He's back on the loose, and now he knows that we have everything we need to convict him of murder. Freedom from police custody transformed Carlos into an even more dangerous predator, who blamed Sarah personally for destroying the quiet life he had built under his false identity. "You ruined everything I worked 20 years to create," Carlos told Sarah during a threatening phone call to her hotel room just hours after his escape. "Miguel Torres was a peaceful man who bothered nobody, but you couldn't leave the past alone. Now you're going to pay the price for destroying my life and dragging me back into this nightmare I thought I had left behind forever." The manhunt resumed with increased urgency as Carlos returned to the dense jungle terrain where he held every possible advantage over pursuing law enforcement officers. Detective Santos coordinated search teams throughout the night, knowing that Carlos would use the familiar wilderness to plan his next move against Sarah. "Carlos knows every trail, cave, and hiding spot in this jungle," Santos explained to her officers. "He's not running away this time. He's positioning himself to strike back at the person he holds responsible for his capture and exposure." Hotel security proved inadequate when Carlos managed to infiltrate the building and track Sarah to her room, forcing her to flee through emergency exits while he pursued her with deadly intent. "I can smell your fear," Carlos shouted as Sarah ran through the hotel corridors, desperately seeking help from other guests and staff members. Sarah managed to reach the parking garage and get into her rental car, but Carlos appeared at the driver's side window with a knife, forcing her to speed away while he gave chase on foot toward the jungle area. The pursuit led through increasingly dense forest terrain as Sarah abandoned her car and followed Detective Santos deeper into Carlos's natural territory, where he had prepared for exactly this kind of final confrontation. "Stay close to me," Santos told Sarah as they moved carefully through the jungle trails, both women knowing that Carlos was somewhere nearby, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to attack. The sounds of the tropical forest masked their movements, but also concealed Carlos's approach as he stalked them through his familiar hunting grounds. Carlos ambushed them at a small clearing where he had been waiting with a pistol he had somehow acquired during his brief period of freedom. "Welcome to my real home," Carlos said as he stepped out from behind a large tree, pointing the weapon directly at Sarah's chest. "This is where I brought Jessica and Michael 20 years ago, and this is where I'm going to finish what you started when you decided to dig up my past. Detective Santos, drop your weapon or watch Sarah die right now." With Sarah held at gunpoint, Carlos began describing in graphic detail exactly how he planned to kill her, in the same manner he had murdered Jessica 2 decades earlier. "Your daughter begged for her life in this exact spot," Carlos told Sarah with cruel satisfaction. "She cried for her mother and promised me anything if I would just let her go home to Denver. But I explained to Jessica that some people don't deserve happiness, and now I'm going to teach you the same lesson before I send you to join her in death." Detective Santos attempted to negotiate with Carlos while slowly positioning herself for a rescue attempt, but his psychological state had deteriorated beyond reason during his years of hiding. "There's no way out of this jungle for any of us," Carlos declared, keeping the gun trained on Sarah while watching Santos carefully. "I've been planning for this day ever since I buried those 2 lovers behind my house. Either I kill both of you and disappear forever, or I die here in my jungle where I belong." Even after Detective Santos managed to wound Carlos with a gunshot to his shoulder, he refused to surrender and made one final desperate attack on Sarah with a hunting knife. "If I'm going to die, you're coming with me," Carlos screamed as he lunged toward Sarah despite his injury. The wounded man fought with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose, slashing wildly with the knife, while Sarah tried to protect herself from his frenzied assault. When Carlos continued his attack, despite multiple commands to surrender, Detective Santos was forced to use lethal force to protect Sarah's life from the crazed killer. The final gunshots echoed through the jungle as Carlos collapsed to the forest floor. His 20-year reign of terror finally ended by the same violence he had used against his innocent victims. "It's over," Santos told Sarah as they both stared at Carlos's motionless body. "He can't hurt anyone ever again." In the immediate aftermath of the deadly confrontation, Sarah survived the ordeal, but remained deeply traumatized by her close encounter with the man who had murdered her daughter. "I looked into the same eyes that Jessica saw in her final moments," Sarah told Detective Santos, as they waited for backup officers to secure the scene. "At least now I know the complete truth about what happened to her, and I know that her killer has finally paid the price for his crimes. Jessica can rest in peace now." 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to Denver with Jessica's remains for the proper burial that had been delayed for 21 years of uncertainty and searching. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of people who had supported Sarah throughout her long quest for answers about her daughter's disappearance. "Today, we're not just saying goodbye to Jessica," Sarah said during her eulogy. "We're celebrating the fact that justice was finally served and that her killer can never hurt another family the way he hurt ours." 6 months after Carlos's death, Sarah established the Jessica Mitchell Memorial Scholarship to help young couples pursue their dreams without fear, finally finding peace in knowing the complete truth about her daughter's fate. "Jessica's story doesn't end with her murder," Sarah explained during the scholarship announcement ceremony. "Her legacy lives on through helping other young people achieve the happiness that was stolen from her and Michael 20 years ago. Evil tried to win, but love and justice prevailed in the end." If you enjoyed this story, write in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you in the next story.